Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest, Neal Stephenson, is a touchstone writer and thinker in the world of science fiction. His 1992 breakthrough novel, Snow Crash, was named by Time magazine as one of the top 100 all-time best English language novels. Since then, Stephenson has tackled many topics with his trademark one-two punch of scientific rigor and inventive storytelling. Code-breaking in World Wars in Cryptonomicon, historical fiction and the origins of science with the Baroque cycle, philosophy and mathematics in Anathem, and high-stakes global adventure and video game economics in Reamd. His unique perspective on the intersections of science, technology, and sociology have also drawn the attention of people outside the world of books. He was hired by Jeff Bezos' space company, Blue Origin, that launched a rocket into space this month. He holds the title of Chief Futurist at Magic Leap, a company developing a virtual reality technology framework, and he is involved with the Tall Tower Project at Arizona State University's Center for Science and the Imagination. Neal Stephenson is here today on Between the Covers to talk about his latest book, Seveneves, which Publishers Weekly in their starred review describes as such. Stephenson's remarkable novel is deceptively complex, a disaster story, and transhumanism tale that serves as the delivery mechanism for a series of technical and sociological visions. Booklist adds, Seveneves contains the most realistic and relatable cast of characters and a scatological narrative history. Welcome to Between the Covers, Neal Stephenson.
Thanks for inviting me.
So Seveneves starts with the line, "The moon blew up without warning and for no apparent reason." And it isn't clear to the scientists of the world why the moon has blown up, but it is soon clear there's a scientific consensus of what this means for the world. So can you tell our listeners what we learn pretty quickly in Seveneves about what humanity faces?
Yeah, at the beginning, it's just a kind of a scientific wonder. But after a few days, two pieces of the former moon bang into each other at random, and one of them breaks in half, and there's the scientists begin thinking about what that implies and do some calculating, and they figure out that in a kind of known, predictable span of time, like something like 2 years, this process is going to go exponential, and the moon's fragments are going to grind each other up into kind of a sea of gravel in space, and some of that is going to come down into the Earth's atmosphere and render it impossible to live on the Earth.
And impossible to live on the Earth for
5,000 years.
For a long time. Tell us whether you drew this scenario mostly out of your imagination or whether you did ultimately consult your own science background or scientists to figure out whether that would actually occur.
Well, the basic scenario is mostly my imagination. That's kind of, to tell you the truth, it's the least scientifically founded, most speculative part of the whole thing. There is actually some concern about space junk, about debris and spent boosters and so on that human activity has left in orbit around the Earth that could create a similar problem on a much, much smaller scale by slamming into each other in orbit and fragmenting into so many pieces of junk that it would be hazardous to launch spacecraft into orbit. So that's where I got the idea from, but I've blown it up much to a much larger degree in this book just so I could have an excuse for people to build a space ark.
Well, let's talk about the space ark. Humanity has 2 years to figure out a solution before the Earth is going to be inhospitable and perhaps everybody on it no longer alive. How do the world's communities come up with a way to both maintain order and also maintain hope?
Well, the maintaining order part, I don't put a whole lot of attention to in this book just because my reading of the way people behave under stress and under crisis is that maintaining order isn't as much of an issue as a lot of makers of disaster movies would have you believe. I think history shows that for the most part, when there's a big disaster or a big a war or an earthquake or something like that that forces people to work together, they tend to do it. It tends to be when people's best natures come out. But one of the reasons that they do it is that they're given a task to work on, and that task is contributing one way or the other to the building of this ark, the so-called cloud ark. Instead of being one big ship, it's a swarm of smaller ships. And so that's kind of the early part of the book, is telling the story of that and how the people of Earth sort of work together to get that going.
And unlike Noah's Ark, this is mostly a way to figure out a way to save some portion of humanity in space, but also flora and fauna, but not in live form.
Yeah, because of the big thing kind of scientifically that's changed, since I was a kid reading books about space arcs, is that we have ways to digitally store genetic information now, and so clearly we're not going to be taking blue whales and sequoias into space and keeping them alive for 5,000 years, but it's easy to put the bits on a thumb drive and preserve that. So therefore the emphasis is on preserving a sample of human diversity and getting humans up there, and putting them in a position where they can hopefully reproduce and keep the species going.
One of the things that I found really refreshing about Seveneves in this scenario is to see both a scientific consensus around what's going to happen to the planet, but also people accepting the scientific consensus for the most part and working together towards it. It's particularly in contrast to what we're seeing with climate change, where we have mostly a scientific consensus, but that's not necessarily translating in a coming together.
Yeah, that was very much on my mind when I was kind of laying out this scenario. If you're going to write a space arc book, you've got to have a pretty finely calibrated end of the world scenario. It's got to be something that happens slowly enough that there's time to build an ark. But not so slowly that we wouldn't just go out and fix the problem. The other thing is that it has to be obvious. It has to be something that people cannot sit around and argue about, like global climate change. And that was one of the reasons that I favored this idea of the moon blowing up, is that it was just so shocking and obvious that I wouldn't have to kind of write a whole section of the book where people argued about what was happening.
Well, you mentioned just earlier about a lot of the portrayals of catastrophe in the media, which you think are ultimately different than the way humans actually respond to catastrophe. Do you think there's a difference between the way humans tend to respond to slow catastrophes versus sudden ones? We obviously, with earthquakes and hurricanes and such, it does seem like people rally and come together and help people they don't know. Mm-hmm. But with climate change, for instance, which ends up seeming abstract because we can't connect it maybe even to something tangible in our lifetimes, or we could doubt what's happening in our lifetimes, perhaps, that maybe we're less well equipped to figure that out.
Yeah, people respond to weather, but they don't respond to climate, because weather is visible with your own eyes and you feel its effects, and it happens over a span of hours or days. But climate, your brain gets involved and starts fouling things up by arguing about whether it's really happening or not.
In case you just tuned in, you're listening to Between the Covers, and we're talking today to author Neal Stephenson about his latest novel, Seveneves. One of the main characters, and one of my favorite characters, is Doc Dubois, who is a celebrity scientist who seems to be loosely based on Neil deGrasse Tyson. What are your thoughts on celebrity scientists in the real world and science popularizers?
Mm-hmm. Well, the good ones are, I think, really foundational to a well-functioning republic in a way. I mean, you've got to have these people who can serve as a bridge, who have legit scientific credentials, but who can also go on the Today Show. So you've got to be able to. Those people are really important to have around, and we kind of rely on them to perform that role. And so the first question that came into my mind, when I started coming up with this scenario, was if this actually happened, who would we look to explain it? Who would be the leaders? And I think that those few people who can bridge between hard science and the popular imagination would suddenly become even more important than they are now.
Well, when I think about science popularizers and I think about Neil deGrasse Tyson and back to Carl Sagan, it seems like they're speaking to a very, at least in my mind, it seems like they're speaking to a very different world. And I wonder if you share that idea that when Carl Sagan was big in the 80s and talking about the ways in which a manned mission to Mars could really elevate humanity, it felt like we were still in sort of the wave of technological optimism in a way. And I don't know if we had more scientific literacy then as a population, but I wonder, compared to what Neil deGrasse Tyson's having to do with a similar enterprise, but maybe a totally different audience.
Yeah, I think it boils down to the fragmentation of where we get our information, right? So back then in the Carl Sagan era, we were coming out of it, but we were still kind of in the era of, you sit down at the end of every day and watch the nightly news on one of 3 television networks, and the content that is up there is has been kind of curated and vetted by serious people, and now you can get your news and your ideas from anywhere you want.
To further this question of optimism, you're one of the more notable writers in science fiction who I think puts forth a certain optimism in your books, the optimism around the capability of technology and human ingenuity. And even though in this book, the vast majority of people very quickly at the beginning are no longer alive, it still feels like it has a certain bent towards optimism and a do-it-yourself, can-do sort of philosophy. Why do you think today, mostly, almost exclusively, it seems like the things that we see in front of us are dystopian and apocalyptic?
Well, I think that first of all, you have to make a distinction between what we see in books versus screen media. So books, science fiction books, present a really wide diversity of visions of the future, but the media that we see in movies, television, video games, and so on is very strongly skewed towards dystopian visions, and I've been thinking about that for a long time, about why that is. I think there's a certain air that, or a certain idea that that's cool. That so Blade Runner, for example, was incredibly formative in the lives of a lot of film directors. They still look to that as kind of their benchmark for what looks like a cool future. I also think that just in purely economic terms, it is a lot easier and cheaper to create a dystopian vision than a utopian one. And that started with, I think it really started with Planet of the Apes, where at the end of the movie you see the Statue of Liberty falling over in the sand. That is a really cheap special effect, right? But it says a lot. It's super powerful. It really had a big punch. And you see the descendants of that all over the movies today, where people will just take, a cityscape or a building that we know and kind of throw some dirt on it and knock out some windows, and suddenly you've got a vision of a dystopia. So whereas, for example, when James Cameron did Avatar and had to create a completely new original world, that was unbelievably expensive because everything had to be designed from scratch. So I actually think there's a pretty strong economic imperative that's pushing film directors and makers of video games and so on to just go for the easy, cheap, dystopian vision.
And also, I know you speak a lot about how you don't feel like we're doing big things today like we did in the first half of the century, when we start the century with no planes, and mid-century we're on the moon.
Yeah.
I would imagine just the general populace isn't seeing a lot of these bold acts the way we used to see them. And the sense of dystopia that, along with economic decline,
Right.
the limiting horizon of possibilities, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that there's a, there's a reason why both the United States and the Soviet Union put so much money into the space program and other kind of big achievements. And it wasn't just that. It went back at least as far as the 30s. The fascist powers and the communist powers and the capitalists were all trying to build impressive stuff to kind of blow people's minds and create the idea of progress. And they were trying to make statements about their political systems, but there's another kind of message that's carried by that, which is a general belief that that technology is on an upward march and we're making awesome things, and the future is radiant. So regardless of what you think about those propaganda statements, they did lead to a general belief on the part of many people that we were kind of on a firmly established upward trend that was going to keep going, to the moon and Mars and beyond.
In case you just tuned in, you're listening to Between the Covers, and we're talking today to author Neal Stephenson about his latest novel, Seveneves. So, Neal, let's hear a little bit of the prose from Seveneves.
Sure. This is just a brief sample from very early in the book, after the moon has just blown up. Rufus McQuarrie saw it all happen above the black ridgeline of the Brooks Range in northern Alaska. Rufus operated a mine there. On clear nights, he would drive his pickup truck to the top of a mountain that he and his men had spent the day hollowing out. He would take his telescope, a 12-inch Cassegrain, out of the back of the truck and set it up on the summit and look at the stars. When he got ridiculously cold, he would retreat into the cab of his truck. He kept the engine running and hold his hands over the heater vents until his fingers regained feeling. Then, as the rest of him warmed up, he would put those fingers to work communicating with friends, family, and strangers all over the world. And off it. After the moon blew up and he convinced himself that what he was seeing was real, he fired up an app that showed the positions of various natural and man-made celestial bodies. He checked the position of the International Space Station. It happened to be swinging across the sky 260 miles above and 2,000 miles south of him. He pulled a contraption onto his knee. He had made it in his little machine shop. It consisted of a telegraph key that looked to be about 150 years old, mounted on a contoured plastic block that strapped to his knee with hook and loop. He began to rattle off dots and dashes. A whip antenna was mounted to the bumper of his pickup truck, reaching for the stars. 260 miles above and 2,000 miles south of him, the dots and dashes came out of a pair of cheap speakers zip-tied to a conduit in a crowded, can-shaped module that made up part of the International Space Station.
You've been listening to Neal Stephenson read from Seveneves. Neal, can you tell us about the hieroglyph project, what a hieroglyph is, and what the hieroglyph project's aim is?
Yeah, this was a project that came out of a sort of unplanned encounter with Michael Crow, who's the president of Arizona State University, a couple of years ago at a conference. And I was talking about what you and I were just discussing a minute ago. And he sort of issued a challenge saying that he felt that the engineers of the world and the scientists and the big institutions were ready to go out and do ambitious things, but that the science fiction writers had been slacking off, writing kind of gloomy, navel-gazing, dystopian junk, and that we needed to get off our butts and create some awesome new visions that people would want to realize. And that was, issued in a friendly spirit, but it was a serious challenge. So out of that came this project. We created a new entity at Arizona State called the Center for Science and the Imagination, and we collaborated with HarperCollins on making this anthology of science fiction stories that were intended to depict kind of more optimistic or constructive visions of the future. But we didn't want to go back and have them be sort of naive, kind of 50s and 60s era stuff either, because you can't go back. So my contribution was a story about constructing an extremely tall tower out in the desert, just building it out of steel and reaching all the way up into what most people would consider outer space.
And the purpose of the tower for launching aircraft with far less fuel?
The economic purpose of the tower is a little bit of a, if you build it, they will come kind of thing. The idea is that there's no one economic application of it that could possibly make enough money to pay for building it. And so the guy who funds it, who's just an individual with a lot of money, has some initial ideas on launching rockets from the top and that sort of thing. But as it goes up, it attracts other people who have other ideas, like building a high altitude airport and using it for sort of recreational purposes and making it into a tourist destination.
And the word hieroglyph, is that point to this notion of creating a vision but not necessarily knowing its endpoint usage?
That came out of a conversation in which we were talking about the role that certain iconic ideas or images played in classic science fiction. So one would be, for example, the Heinlein-style rocket ship that descends on its pillar of fire and lands on its fins. Another one might be, say, the three laws of robotics or what have you. But there's sort of very clear images or ideas that get fixed in people's memories, and then kind of motivate them to try to realize those things.
And do you feel like in your actual books that science fiction is part of a vanguard around actual science ideas? It feels to me like when, at the very minimum, that your books are trying to be demonstrative around the ways in which humans can do long-term thinking. And I think of the 10,000-year-old clock and Anathema, and then obviously this 5,000-year contingency plan for humans in Seveneves.
Well, I would sort of turn it around a little bit and say that that's maybe the only way that science fiction can actually be of direct utility, is that occasionally we hear from somebody who's become a entrepreneur or a scientist or an engineer that they got inspired by a work of science fiction and have been working toward that. And in some cases, you hear of a whole organization that is kind of using a science fictional vision as a template so that everybody in that organization understands what it is that they're collectively working toward. Kind of saves on a lot of unnecessary PowerPoint presentations if everybody has the same vision. So, this was just a kind of, well, first of all, it was an experiment, and we don't know yet if it's actually going to be a successful experiment. But it's an experiment to see what happens if you just sit down and consciously try to create those sorts of iconic hieroglyphs, those iconic images that might inspire people to work towards something.
Well, in a lot of your books, Neal, you've had real historical characters. You've had Turing, you've had Leibniz. In this book, it feels like you have some characters that resonate with contemporary figures. We have the Doc Dubois character and Neil deGrasse Tyson, but the President of the United States, Julia, also feels like she resonates with Hillary Clinton to me. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I was curious if you were looking for a contemporary conversation with the characters that you were creating in Seveneves.
No, I don't really like to operate that way. In a way, it's inconvenient that that this book ended up getting written and coming out just at the time when Hillary Clinton is getting her presidential campaign underway, and stands a decent chance of being the first female president, because that kind of coincidence does lead people to draw those connections. So I like to steer people away from that sort of thing. Particularly given some of what happens later in the book.
Well, one of the things that I think is crucial about having the Julia character, the President of the United States, in the book is it really complicates this problem-solving issue, because it's bringing into the narrative the political mindset. And if everyone was just operating from a scientific mindset and not from a political mindset, things would be much simpler, and the narrative becomes complex, but also the solution for how to save humanity becomes more complex when you introduce democracy or you introduce these conflicting voices. And you talked earlier about the big projects that were done between the Soviet Union and the United States, and even in fascist Europe. And I had a guest on earlier for his book, Benjamin Parzibak, and he was talking about the role of dictators in ancient Rome, and that they didn't have a stigma, but they were actually used or hired temporarily for crises or specific wars or specific catastrophes. So you'd say, you're fighting Italy, you're going to have a dictator for this specific war, or there's this crisis going on, we need a dictator. What are your thoughts on democracy, big projects, and this issue of how do we solve like large things while also dealing with people who have things that are working at cross purposes due to political reasons?
Yeah, no, that's actually a tension that's addressed in the book. There's people kind of explicitly argue about this in the book. And it came up in the Tall Tower thing too. A situation, for example, where some interesting proposals have been made on what we might do about climate change. There's ideas for geoengineering. There's ideas for trying to implement carbon sequestration on a very large scale. And from a scientific point of view, it's not hard to argue that we should absolutely go out and do those things. Clearly, climate change is happening, and clearly it's going to be a huge disaster. But it then when you try to translate that into action, it seems like the only governmental structure that would be capable of implementing those measures would be one that has more power than we like our governments to have. It is a dictator kind of situation, and geoengineering in particular raises a lot of legitimate concerns about who gets to say how we're going to change, how we're going to engineer the climate. So I don't have an answer. It's a really awkward place that we've come to. We need, in some ways, we need that kind of decisive action, but experience has taught us that endowing a government with enough power to take that action is incredibly dangerous.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to author Neal Stephenson about his latest book, Seveneves. To follow up on this idea of geoengineering, it isn't a spoiler if you've read the back of the book to say that 2/3 of the way in, we are confronted with the saying 5,000 years later, and the book jumps forward 5,000 years. And it also shifts its concerns from physics to biology, to simplify things. But one of the questions that gets raised that different people in humanity have different answers to is, I think, even though this question isn't raised explicitly, is should humans manipulate nature? Are humans part of nature? I have a sense of where you land on this, but I would love to hear more about human manipulation of nature in your mind, and what you were thinking of when you were working on this part of the book.
Well, what they're trying to do is re-terraform Earth. So Earth's been turned into a dead, inhospitable planet, and they have a plan they've been developing for a very long time to drop comets on the surface to flood it with water again and rebuild the atmosphere and create a world that people can go back to and live on. And it's clear that it's all going to be artificial, right? There's no question of having anything about it be natural, and so it becomes a question of what specific kind of nature do we want, with nature in scare quotes, and how are we going to get there? So there's various debates that they have about that, but part of what I was thinking of when I wrote that was a couple of really interesting books by Charles Mann called 1491 and 1493, where he talks about what the Americas were like before Columbus showed up and how they changed after Columbus showed up. And, one of the difficult things I had to come to terms with reading those books was the idea that what I had taken to be nature when I was a kid, sort of idealized concept of nature, wasn't at all sort of natural. Everything about the Americas had been geoengineered over thousands of years by the pre-Columbian people who lived here. The Amazon rainforest is a human-made garden that just got overgrown when the humans were killed by imported European diseases. And the prairies of North America, where I grew up, were sort of artificially maintained by controlled fires set by the Native Americans who lived in that part of the world. And the herds of buffalo that I had been taught were sort of a natural wonder were, sort of not quite domesticated, but let's say that they were there because the Indians wanted them to be there. So the whole idea of nature and wilderness that I grew up with kind of got exploded by those books. And that served as a little bit of context for me when I was writing the part of Seveneves where people are descending from space again to try to make the Earth into a functioning ecosystem.
And you also touch on epigenetics and the manipulating of the genome and potentially speeding up evolution in certain ways. Talk to us a little bit about what, if anything, in epigenetics today is what spurred on some of those things in Seveneves.
Well, it's kind of a nascent field, which science fiction writers love nascent fields because it you can get up to speed on it and make some crazy extrapolations pretty fast. Before the kind of disappointment and frustration of real science begins to set in. So epigenetics just means that you can know everything there is to know about the DNA of an organism, and still it turns out that you know very little about what that organism is going to look like and how it's going to respond to its environment, because there's other factors that aren't readable from the DNA that come into play. There's genes that can be suppressed or expressed. They can be turned on and off depending on circumstances. and so it's a much more complex phenomenon than I was brought up to believe when we thought DNA was all there was. So in Seveneves, I'm not trying to fully do justice to the field of epigenetics, but I am trying to kind of show some awareness of it and play with some of the ideas that have come out of that.
It's pretty common in science fiction and fantasy that we see races that demonstrate certain character traits. So, like, say, Lord of the Rings is a really obvious example, but Star Trek and plenty of other examples. But here in Seveneves, we have races that have evolved through human choice, essentially, using some of these ideas of epigenetics. Do you feel like you are just continuing this tradition, or do you feel like you're in some ways, because of the human choice, interrogating this trope that's within science fiction and fantasy?
I'm trying to do a little of both, but I'm definitely interrogating that trope. I mean, you're absolutely right that essentially all of the big universes in both fantasy and science fiction make use of multiple humanoid races, and conveniently they all can kind of speak the same language. They can interbreed with each other, and yet they look different, and they sort of maintain their cultural qualities. So if you go into Middle Earth, you know that the dwarf is going to be kind of grouchy and earthy and tough, and so on and so forth. So that is commonplace, and science fiction and fantasy fans love that stuff, and I love it. But I thought it would be interesting to kind of ask the question of where those come from. Where do those races come from? It's for example, it's stated in Tolkien that the orcs, the goblins, were essentially elves that were kind of captured and tortured and altered into a different form by Sauron, and that's how they ended up as what they are. And there's actually there's a counter to the Lord of the Rings. It was written by a Russian writer, which is the same story told from the point of view of an orc in Mordor.
Wow.
And
is it any good?
It's really cool. Yeah, he's an orc in Mordor, and he sees his civilization as an industrial civilization that's essentially egalitarian, and that's overthrowing the old order of the elves, who are these aristocratic, patrician, class-bound people. But there's stories being told, by the sort of the people who think elves are cool. So the orcs were always made out to be this oppressed, or this the orcs were always made out to be these kind of one-dimensional evil vermin.
Which feels like one of the failings of Lord of the Rings, in the sense that it minimizes the moral question of killing the orcs, even if you need to.
Yeah.
In those books.
Yeah. So there you see little snatches of conversation between goblins from time to time. It makes it clear they're sentient beings. They have fears. They have aspirations, but it's okay to just massacre them. And you can make similar arguments about the different races in Star Trek, or name your fantasy or science fiction universe of choice. So I thought it would be interesting to create a universe that uses that trope, but in which those races came about through intentional decision making by specific people trying to achieve specific goals.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking to Neal Stephenson about his latest novel, Seveneves. Oh, another way in which you're well regarded, I think, is in your creation of female characters. And there are a lot of very compelling female characters in Seveneves. And one of the reasons, I think, is obvious, because women are going to be more important if we're trying to deal with the survival of the human race in space. But there were other reasons why Dr. Dubois considered women to be potentially superior candidates to go up into the cloud arc. Could you talk about what some of those were?
Yeah, there's, NASA's been doing research on humans in space for a long time, and it appears that there are some advantages that women have. They're less susceptible to radiation disease, for example, because their gonads are on the inside, to put it bluntly. Anyone who is on the average, smaller, is going to take up less space, need less food, less oxygen, and just culturally, for whatever reason, it seems like they have an easier time of it living together in confined circumstances over a long period of time. So space is a realm in which not only is there a kind of equality, but in which women may actually be better cut out to operate there.
Well, it made me think of Richard Leakey and his choice of Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey to be out in the field. I think, if I remember correctly, he actually thought that women would be more resilient in that scenario than men.
I hadn't heard that.
Are there any big ideas that are happening today or that are being discussed today that you're particularly excited about?
Big, like science, technology type ideas?
Yeah, big with vision and potentially ambition
Yeah.
behind them.
Well, my kind of big picture view of the arc of science and technology the last 100 years or so is that it was all kind of, for a while, it was all sort of big toys. It was rockets, it was bombs, it was airplanes. And then suddenly information technology kind of seemed to come out of nowhere. Nobody was predicting that. The science fiction writers I read when I was a kid were pretty good at predicting space stations and rockets, but they totally missed the internet, the personal computer, all of that stuff. So suddenly that happened, and for decades now, all of the smart people have been doing that. The ones who would have been building big stuff in the 50s or 60s have been doing little startups in Silicon Valley and making apps or what have you, which is fine. But I think now we're beginning to see a trend back in the other direction, where people like Elon Musk and others who, got their money by doing information technology startups, are now turning back and saying, well, hey, what if we apply the mindset and the new tools that we have to the older kind of big iron problems of transportation, energy, going into space, what have you. And that is a kind of a fascinating trend that I hope to see more of.
And on that line, are there any books that you've been reading that you've been particularly intrigued by?
Well, none of the books I've been reading lately are applicable to that thing I just said.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, I'm reading Bleak House, Dickens's Bleak House, which I don't know why I picked it up, but
are you happy you picked it up?
Yeah. It's a fascinating book because it's basically a long series of character sketches, sort of loosely stitched together. And fortunately, he's really, really good at it. And so he can describe just an encounter between two people, or he can describe a person and how he's dressed and how he grooms himself and how he carries himself for pages at a time. And it's very finely rendered, and his character types are very recognizable as people we might bump into here on the street any day. But he's working in a in an era where you can get away with writing that way, where people are happy to pick up just a gigantic book that's just a long series of those and kind of read it at their leisure.
There's a really good adaptation with Gillian Anderson of Bleak House on BBC for When You're Done.
Yeah. How long ago did that?
Just a couple of years ago.
Oh, really?
And it's with one of the head of the Lannisters of Game of Thrones is in it, and she's in it. And it's and Carey Mulligan, the actress.
I'll check it out.
It's quite good. In reading about your writing habits, you've written some of your books with fountain pen.
Mm-hmm.
You use a treadmill desk,
Mm-hmm.
and you also often will listen to music that is thematically related. I know with Anathema you were listening to medieval music from a group that's here based in Portland.
Yeah, Capella Romana.
Was Seveneves written with any music particularly linked to it? And were you writing by pen, walking on a treadmill?
There's no common theme to all this. I tend to select a different set of tools and a different environment for every project. It's sort of like a ritual I go through at the end of a book to sort of put aside all of the stuff I used to do the last one and kind of, draw a line under it, and then, I'll find a new environment to start the next book, and I'll often use new tools. So, in the case of Seveneves, at the time I started the book, I already had a bunch of old documents that I had typed into a computer. So I just went ahead and typed that in. I didn't use the fountain pen at all, and I probably did a lot of the work on a treadmill. I didn't listen to a lot of music during this one.
And do you know what your next project's going to be? And
I do.
Can you tip your hand a little bit?
No, I can't tip my hand.
Not even one word?
No.
Well, it was great having you on Between the Covers today, Neal.
It was fun being here. Thanks for a good discussion.
We were talking today with author Neal Stephenson about his latest book, Seveneves. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host.